Okay, I think that we're live now. Awesome. So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Lauren Shade. I'm the community manager at Novel Suspects, and I'm excited to introduce tonight's speakers, Michael Koryta and Sabrina Callahan. Michael is a best-selling author of 18 novels, among winning numerous awards for his writing. His work has been translated into over 20 languages. His forthcoming novel, An Honest Man from Mulholland Books, is on sale July 25th. And Sabrina is the executive director of publicity at Little Brown and Company. With over a decade of experience in the publishing industry, you've worked about on every book that Michael has published, so it should be a really interesting conversation. I'm going to hop off camera and let these two chat, but before I do, a quick reminder that we'll be taking questions at the end of the event. So if you do have questions, use the Crowdcast Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to get those in there. Okay, so with that being said, let's get started.
Thank you. Okay, so let's do this. So I'm very excited to be chatting with you, Michael. We're old friends, and we've known each other, I think now it's 14 years. And we have worked together on so many of your books. We've also had some adventures. And as a publicist, I'm usually behind the scenes of these types of events, but I'll say there seems to be kind of a recurring theme of you pulling me along into very strange and usually dangerous situations, all in service to your books. Which I think is a pretty noble cause, so I'm okay with it. But for example, we met, go ahead. We met at BoucherCon in 2009 in Indianapolis because you took me and your agent to a haunted hotel, which is known for its natural hot springs that have restorative properties, which is the West Baden Springs Hotel. And I think it's been called the eighth wonder of the world. And it was the inspiration for your first novel that we published at Little Brown, So Cold the River, which is now a movie. And also, as I showed you just recently, this vodka that Michael sent me, which I have been drinking, not tonight, but in general. But also, while we stayed at the hotel, I was pretty sure I saw a ghost in both my room and in the hot springs room. There's also the time you took me to a big cat rescue center where the cats gave me a very special welcome by spraying me because I was from New York City and wearing perfume, which you don't do.
Compliment. It was the
they
highest of compliments.
They were calling me their own. They were claiming me. Not to mention all of the various adventures when we were on the road to places like Houston and Cleveland and readings and BoucherCons. But I thought that first trip, I say all this because it was a perfect introduction to so much about you as a writer. And I realized as I was in this like very haunted, beautiful place that you're this kind of writer who can transport a reader to those kinds of places, supernatural situations. And it's because of this dedication to place and those fine, nuanced details of mood and ambiance that you bring to every single book that you write. And I think you bring also like a very personal touch to the choices you make, in particular about setting and little Easter eggs you put in your books. And I was thinking back sort of like to the very beginning, to even before we published you, which was your first book, Tonight I Said Goodbye. And that introduced readers to a private investigator named Lincoln Perry, and it was set in Cleveland, Ohio, which I think is where your parents lived before they moved you to Indiana in the 70s, or your family to Indiana. And I just love that it's like always sort of about everything you've experienced. You bring everything into your writing. You wrote that first book when you were, I think, just 19 or 20 years old, which is supremely annoying. But my first question, we've gotten to it, is can you tell us about the writer you were then when you were 19 and 20 and who you were when you wrote your first full manuscript, and sort of who did you want to be? How did Cleveland and then Indianapolis and your childhood and Bloomington and your family history inform that book and those 4 books?
It's a really good question. In terms of like who I was then, I think I probably had more confidence as a writer at 19 than I ever would have later, and probably ever will have again. And there was no reason for that other than I didn't know what I didn't know. And that's a sort of beautiful place to be as a writer. Like, I didn't come from a creative writing background. I was a criminal justice major. at IU. I had worked for a newspaper, so I had this writing education. My writing mentor was a sports writer named Bob Hamill, who was exceptional. But I didn't have the MFA or any knowledge of publishing whatsoever. So I had this just like beautiful kind of ignorance and the idea of, if I write a story that is good enough, surely it will be published. And that's without even like really, I knew there were agents, but I had no game plan of how to find one. So in 2000, I guess it would have been like 2003, 2004, St. Martin's still had a contest for best first novel for a private eye novel. And I read about that on Steve Hamilton's Dust Jacket. Mm-hmm. And so that was my way in. There was a contest and a publishing deal. First time I was ever in New York, I came to visit my editor. Like, I had never set foot in the city before. And that was, I wrote the book when I was 19. I was 20 when I sold it. I think 21 maybe when it came out. It was right around that time. And as I said, I knew absolutely nothing about the industry, which was great, because all I could focus on was the story. And that was really beneficial. It was not my first book. It was actually not even the first Lincoln Perry book. That was the second. So the first book was the first Lincoln Perry book. I got to an editor named Pete Wolverton, who was with St. Martin's. And that was submitted on just like a cold submission from my friend Bob Hamill to this editor, who was then working on a book about Bob Knight. That's how they knew each other. And Pete read it. There was a moment when it seemed like they were going to take it. And then they kind of backed off that. And he said, we want your first book needs to have a bigger plot hook. And Tonight I Say Goodbye I was already well along the way with that. So while he was passing on my first book, I was busy pitching the sequel to him, which indicates just how naive I was from a business sense. That's not like the savvy way in. But I knew that I loved the story, and I had that character. You asked a great question about Cleveland. I wanted to write in that PI tradition because that was what I read and loved. It was going back to Chandler and Hammett, and then to guys like Dennis Lehane, Robert Crace, Pelicanos, but they were all set in this urban world. And I was a very small town kid. I'd grown up in Bloomington, which is an idyllic little college town, but it's not a great place for, modern noir. So the one urban place that I knew really well, that I knew well enough to write about anyhow, was Cleveland. And Cleveland actually, I think, is a great noir city. Yeah. It has that kind of weight of the past on it from the jump. So I took the one urban environment that I felt like I could sell, and went off to the races with the PI novel. I still have not. I'm working on one now. I've never written a book set in my hometown.
That's right. You are working on one now. You say, okay, I won't make you talk about that yet, but we may come to that later. But that's good to know. So you published that first book like 2021, and now you're very old. You're just 40. So can you tell us sort of about the writer you are now? I love this idea of like just total ignorance for the process, because obviously there was a lot of freedom in that for you. But what about the writer that you are now? And now you have 20 years under your belt. You've published almost 20 novels, which is wild. Plus, I think you've also taken different roads and you've submitted stories to bigger compilations of books, and you've certainly obviously had your hand at like nonfiction writing and reporting. But what now about you is similar to sort of that like writer you were then, and what has changed most about your style or the type of writer you are, or how you approach things now?
The approach probably isn't all that different. I think the one thing that kind of comes along as a scar tissue buildup is a sense of when you're going off the rails, going in the wrong direction. And Josh, if Josh were here, he would be laughing at this, because I'm about to pretend that I'm better at that now than I used to be. I'm still capable of writing, 150 pages in the wrong direction or chasing the wrong character. But I do think you kind of get a better instinct of what's going wrong and why and when. And I think the most valuable element of that is not that you don't do it. Like, I'm always going to screw up in the first draft, but you become a little more, I'm not fearless. It's such a difficult thing when you have to admit that you've written 200 pages that need to be cut. Like, they need to go. And it's not because they were bad. Like, you can do really good writing, but it's not the right writing. There's a difference there. And once you've been through the process enough times where you've made those cuts, you've thrown out a couple hundred pages and gone back and done it again, you at least know, I have been lost in this particular forest before. I found my way out. It all was okay. And I think that just sort of helps. The first couple times that I threw out most of a book, it was, pretty terrifying. The Ridge stands out as an experience with Michael Peach. That's one where, I mean, the whole book, I basically scrapped at the 11th hour, and we started over again. And the sort of the calm that Michael Peach projected as an editor and a publisher, there was sort of a teaching clinic in that I didn't understand at the time. You need to get a little bit more distance to understand what was effective about something. Mm-hmm. And one of Michael's really great gifts as an editor is that he never betrays a lack of confidence. And you feel that, you absorb that, because basically this is a pretty lonely job. I mean, one of the reasons I value our relationship so much is you have been around longer than anyone in my professional life. I've changed publishers, editors, and agents. Like, you are the longest tenured person in my professional life. And because of that natural turnover of the industry, that really does begin to matter. Yeah. And the confidence that an editor offers, I think, is huge, because then you have to go back and do it again and do it alone. But there's that sense of, they believe that I can do this right, even though I might have screwed it up the first time. And you need to just kind of like cultivate that. I don't know if I've answered your question with all that rambling, but the difference in the writer I was then and the writer I am now is hopefully not that dramatic when it comes to approach. I still want to do the story that makes my heart beat a little faster, even if it might not be the logical follow to the book that came before. And I still want to get it right on the first draft, but I now know that I won't.
Yeah. Well, I think, and that's too, if I can say, also just a benefit of age, right? Because I think I'm not a writer, but just in general in life, like, you just get better at making mistakes as you get older, right? And you just know, sort of like, I will come to the right answer. it will end up okay somehow. And speaking of writers and people, so, we published James Patterson, and you've met Jim, and he's a guy who came from like the world of advertising. And when I worked with Jim, it was such a great lesson in, when we came to a meeting with him about what we were going to do for the next book, or what, PR plan or marketing plan, it wasn't about come with the right idea. It was come with 30 ideas, and let's hope half of one of those is sort of salvageable and we'll get to the right idea. But I got really comfortable with him going, nope, 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 nope. But that didn't mean I was bad. It just meant the idea wasn't right. And then you learn that you can like get to the right idea. And I think that's a really valuable lesson in writing, in life, in anything, in advertising, obviously. But I think what's really great is that, like, I love that you came in with this like blind confidence, and what you didn't know actually helped you, right? And now it's what you do know about being okay with making those mistakes. That's probably a big part of what's helping you. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And
you're
you're trying, if you take it seriously, you are trying to identify every weakness, figure out how to improve it, you also are trying to identify every strength and not rely too heavily on those things. If I kind of hate the word proud, but I guess if I'm proud of anything that I did early on, it is um, I was much more concerned about the craft than sort of the salesmanship of it. So when my second and third books were coming out, I was going to writers' conferences not to sell my own stuff, but I was going to, like, when I found out Lehane had that program, Dennis Lehane was teaching at Akron College at Writers in Paradise. I wanted to go learn from him. And what that, like, that's a great example because that changed my life. You know, I met my wife there. I ended up living in St. Pete for about 8 years, made a lot of great friends down there. But the goal, the original thing that led me down there was being very candid about I fumbled my way, like I failed forward into a very good scenario very early. And so then it's like, okay, how do you handle that? And the good thing about working in newspapers was I was very used to getting beaten up by really good writers. You know, the newsroom is a competitive environment. I was in a really good newsroom. Nobody was spending any extra time other than they were very kind, but you have to develop that sort of, if I'm going to be on the front page, if I'm going to have a byline story, I need to get better in a hurry. And so I think the newsroom was actually maybe more beneficial for me as young as I published than, say, an MFA program would have been, just because of that sense of time. You know, when you have deadlines and every day you have to produce, it's very different than saying, I'm going to take 2 or 3 years. I'm going to workshop this. I'm going to get feedback. I think that has enormous value for writers in a certain space. And I was not that writer at that point. The newsroom was exactly like, that was perfect for me. That's where I needed to be.
We're on the same page, literally and figuratively, because my next question was, but I said before turning to writing full time, you worked as a newspaper reporter and you taught at the University School of Journalism at Indiana. And then you also, though, worked as a private investigator as an intern while you were in high school, and then turned that into a day job into the early stages of your writing career. And so my question was going to be talk about how journalism, but also investigation and PI work informed the process and how you were approaching writing. So obviously like that quickness and learning to just like get to a good draft quickly. But what about like the PI side of it or other parts of being a journalist? Like, you got to go out and hit the pavement and talk to people and do your research. Can you talk about how all of that informs what you do when you write?
Yeah, I think there are so many benefits about the PI work. I mean, on the obvious level, the surface level, I was getting paid for research, right? I was writing PI novels, and now I understood a little bit about the industry. And so coming in, even though I was very young at the start, I actually knew more about the reality of the PI business than like 95% of the PI writers in the room, because I had done it. I was doing it. But on a deeper level, both journalism and PI work, no day is the same, and you're talking to different people from different walks of life at all times. And you need to be able to sort of figure out how to put them at ease enough that they don't shut down on you. You know, you've got to keep them talking. And so you need to become a little bit of a chameleon. And you need to become fluid enough with language and the way people talk that they don't immediately say, they're willing to keep going, whether that's you avoid a confrontational sense or it's you build up a rapport. You just need to be able to sort of keep that going, and you develop an ear. I think if you're any good at it, you have to develop an ear for cadence and the very unique sort of rhythms and patterns of speech. And that was again, this is something that at the time I didn't realize. Now looking back, I do. That was just like a clinic in good dialogue, and the way characters can be created so quickly from just cadence. It's not even what they say, it's how they say it. So that obviously had its benefits. it also made me, I was always used to being the youngest person in the room. I mean, when you're 19 years old and you're doing PI work, that's odd. 19 years old and doing, journalism is pretty rare. So by the time I kind of came along in publishing, I was actually pretty comfortable being like the oddity and just dealing with that. That being said, I was always the PI and the journalist are always working the corners of the room. Like you are not the center of the room. So that was a different gear once I actually going out and doing any of the promotional work was very counter to any of the skill set that I had built up, which is kind of hanging back, being more observant, making the snarky remark. But you're not there in front of the crowd.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you. We ask a lot of authors, we ask them to do this like incredibly vulnerable, like solitary thing, and then we thrust them into the promotional part of it, which as a publicist, I always try to remember, I think my job is hard, but then you guys actually have to be on and delivering in the moment. So I try to remember that. So you put me into a very harrowing situation with the Ridge, as we mentioned, when we went to the Exotic Feline Rescue Center, which is in Center Point, Indiana.
If you
Because
hadn't been sprayed by the first tiger,
I
the
wouldn't have been
next
sprayed
7
by the
might
next
never have
24.
happened. It was
It
the
was like
first one
20.
that got you was a snowballing effect at that point.
I keep trying to remember it was affectionate on their part. They were trying to claim me. And it was really an incredible look into sort of the research you did. We got to see these incredible cats, and Joe, the guy who ran the place, is just like a hero. And you yourself, as part of the getting ready for that book and learning about it, joined in on some rescue missions and watched them happen in front of you. You used to like pack a bag to go to BEA, and in your suitcase would be a suit, but also like a trank gun for a big cat. And then
we did have to figure out, if you could be in the business a long time, I want to know the next time you have to figure out shipping a dart rifle home and the author in, let me know. That's
exactly. It's always shaping new skills for me. And then before you wrote Those Who Wish Me Dead, which features like a kid who witnesses a murder, and he's issued a false identity, and he's going into a wilderness skills program for troubled teens, right? They're going to hide him. So you yourself went to survival school, and luckily I was not forced into it, but you've always been sort of this, we call you the method writer, right? The method researcher. So where did that come from? Like, why did you take that track into your research when you probably could have just read about exotic felines online, or you could have just read about survival school? But what sort of took you into that road to live the experience?
part of it is definitely the journalism background. That there's the one truism of like any newsroom is, if you want to find the best reporter, they will be the person who's not at their desk. They're going to be out in the field. So that was something that I had been taught early, but then I don't know. I find it so fundamentally fascinating. People who do weird things, like people who do really odd things, like raise 200 tigers and lions at the end of this dirt road in Indiana. That's so fundamentally weird and fascinating. And then once you get into the weeds, I don't know. The details of getting down into the weeds of sort of unique professions and unique experiences really fascinate me as a person. So I think I start there, where it is pretty natural for me to want to do like nuts and bolts work. And then as a writer, you need to be able to excuse your research. Like when you disappear for a week and come back, with a bag of laundry that smells of lions and tigers and maybe dead cattle, you need to be able to explain that this was actually worth doing. And the one way I would try to justify that is to say, it really does force you to experience the character's world with all 5 senses. And you can read about it. A lot of the research that I do that makes the final book comes from reading, probably the bulk of it. but it is very difficult to fake all five senses. And if you're taking research that you only have grabbed from the page and transporting it onto another page, I think that weakness shows up. You're going to get one of the senses wrong. And if you get them all right, you can immerse the reader in the narrative on a much deeper level. So what I'm always focused on is this idea of emotional investment. You know, if I have the reader's emotional investment, they are going to stay with me. And that is achieved, I think, by putting them as deep into the situation as possible from the life experience of the character. Part of that should be tactile. You know, you do need to not just see what the character sees and think what they think, but it is the setting as place idea. Every day your setting kind of pushes back on you. I don't care what your setting is, whether that's, you know, your husband and your kids at home, or it's the angry tiger outside the door. There's always those moments of friction, those little obstacles between you and the thing that you need to get done are the way, I think, one of the best ways to immerse the reader in this person's full life, their real life.
That's a great answer, and it's funny because it brings me right. So we will talk about An Honest Man, but this question sort of leads us into that, but also about this like emotional experience and feeling that you want the reader to have. And one thing I have to ask about is you're writing about children and children in peril. You and I have had this conversation before, but just about like how you approach this and what boundaries there are around this. And I'm a parent, I have 2 little kids, and it's gotten harder for me. I'm a horror fan, but horror and even thrillers, it's gotten harder for me with kids to read books where kids are in danger. But the authors who do it right, you do it great, Dennis Lehane does it great. You always Michael Connelly does it great. You always manage to sort of approach it with like this care and depth. And I'd love to hear a little bit about this element in your stories, especially because you've had some kids, teenagers in peril, and they end up often being heroes in the book to some extent or another.
That is a great question. First of all, I don't know if I would and could do it in the same way if I was a parent. I'm not sure. I think the minute you're done, and you failed all of your responsibilities as a writer and as a human, is the moment you view the kid in peril as a prop. Like if you're viewing it as, quote, child in jeopardy with the idea of this appeals to a certain audience, you've just failed. So it has to be the real, and again, I get to that idea of emotional investment. What is the authentic sense from the kid's point of view? And I think something that really frustrates me with writers who, to my mind, don't do this well, is that they forget the level of sophistication a kid has emotionally, and intellectually too. I mean, we'll see that all the time. But when you're particularly at an adolescent sort of point in life, I'm trying to think. So, Lyman in this book is 12. Jace in Those Wish Me Dead. That matters to me. But when you're in that sort of threshold moment, you feel you have a maturity. You feel you don't need your parents. You don't need that helping hand. And then you end up in real trouble and you're a child again. Even if the real trouble is, just as mundane as you can imagine, the moment you hit it, you want your parent, right? We've all lived through that. So when you think about connections with readers, this is something we've all experienced. We all carry that sort of muscle memory and emotional memory. The other thing that is very important for me to remember, and this is where the PI work really, I think, informs some of what I do. The most depressing and most memorable and haunting cases I ever worked involved children in peril who did not have that adult to reach out to. And I don't want to get too specific on those cases, but I worked a couple that really, really lingered. And Lyman from An Honest Man is that kid. So Jace in Those Who Wish Me Dead comes from, he has good parents. He's in a terrible scenario, but he has people working to protect him. Lyman does not. And so he's sort of forging that bond. And I think one of the things that draws me to writing from the point of view of a child is they have an inherent hopefulness that really, I find that so refreshing, particularly in crime and thriller writing, where we have this sort of like anti-hero obsession and the world-weary guy or the world-weary woman who, they're all cynical. There's this sort of chip on the shoulder. I get tired of writing that. And the hopefulness that a child can inject into a narrative and the eye for beauty in the world, particularly beauty in a world that might seem really grim, I think provides this incredible balance that for me as a writer allows it to it generates its own momentum because we have the world and all of its threats pushing down. And then we have this, Lyman is the core of this, is Lyman sort of persevering on this island that seems not to want him, but he's not beaten by that. And I think kids are the most hopeful narrators of, honestly, the human story. If you want to find a reason to be optimistic about the human experiment, you're not going to find it on our end. You're going to find it, on the other end of the scale.
I agree. So you have these great characters. Some are kids, some are grown-ups. Can you name a favorite character of yours? Both who's your favorite kid you've written, and then who's your favorite older character? I think I know which older character you're going to say, but I'll let you answer.
The kid's an interesting one. I'm going to say Lyman. I loved Jace in Those Who Wish Me Dead, but I think because Jace was surrounded by those kind of like helpful people that I'm talking about, he didn't feel quite as in control of his own. He wasn't pushing against his fate with the same level of tenacity that Lyman brings from page 1 to the end. So, I love Lyman. He's my favorite of the kids. My favorite, and I do think you're going to know, but most readers would not guess it. My favorite of the adult protagonists is Adam Austin from The Prophet. Would you have gotten that right?
I would have said him, or God, forgive me for forgetting her last name, but from So Cold the River, the old lady.
Anne McKinney.
Annie, yeah, that's who I thought you were going to say. Yeah. But The Prophet, I feel like that character too is, if I can go this far, and you don't have to answer this question, don't have to confirm or deny, might be most like you.
You are the only person who ever said that, and it was a spot on. That people talk about Lincoln Perry. Anytime you're writing in first person, I think there's more of a natural bridge for people to say like, "Oh, that's you." They confuse you with the character, because the voice, if you did it well, the voice feels intimate. Adam Austin would feel, to most people looking outside in, his experience could not be farther from mine. And even, his personal history, his worldview, it all seems very, very different. But of all the characters I've ever written, the one who just sort of hit that emotional bell that kind of stayed rung very, very easily was Adam.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys are like brothers in another life. Twins, maybe. So
I got luckier than Adam did.
You did. It's true. It's true. Thank goodness. So we mentioned the West Baden Springs Hotel and the Exotic Feline Rescue Center, and you really do have that like sort of unbelievable feel for place. Can you walk us through the setting for An Honest Man, and talking about sort of like Maine and the time you've been spending there that influenced this book, and Salvation Point and all of this, how it came together for you as the place where this book had to be set.
Yeah, I started spending part of the year in Maine in, I guess it was 2015, 2016. And it's become more and more of the year as time goes by. I'm drawn to beautiful places in general, and Maine is absolutely stunning. But I love the beautiful place that hides threat and a sense of menace, and particularly a sense of the past just breathe the neck of the present. And Maine has all of that, and then some. But where the book came from, so I've gotten to know a bunch of the islands in the mid-coast. My wife and I live in Camden, which is sort of, if you don't know Maine, it's kind of between Bar Harbor and Portland. But there are all these little island communities out there: Vinyl Haven, Islesboro, Monhegan. They're all very different. And there was a crime that happened in, I think, 2020. I feel like it was early in lockdown. And there were the news articles about this. I'm a newspaper junkie, so I read like every Maine newspaper that exists. And they were talking about the one cop who was in charge of this island where this murder had occurred. And I thought, well, that alone is just extraordinary. The idea of, one deputy or one officer being in charge of policing a community, because what it really bumps into then is the culture of the community itself. And the idea of the island sort of saying, like, we're good, right? Like, we'll police our own. And that bounced off an idea of a character I'd had for a while, but I hadn't found the right entry point in. And that Israel Pike was someone I'd sort of like played around with in other books. And he just never fit the story. So he worked so naturally as someone returning to an island. As I said, I want setting to create that mirror of the character, right? Ideally, you have either they're running parallel or they're running perpendicular and they smack into each other. But that emotional sense of a community that was very intimate, and he is of that community, but they don't want him back. And I had tried to work him into stories where that would have been a more urban setting, kind of like the neighborhood guy thing. And he just never really worked. But the moment I brought him onto that island, we were off to the races. The book comes from the opening scene of the book is this guy, Israel, who's a lobsterman on this island, going out to a yacht, a luxury yacht that's floating offshore. And it's clear to him, with his sort of veteran eye, it's clear to him that it's not operating under its own power. There's no one behind the controls of this thing. And so he climbs on board the yacht and discovers this really gruesome scene where there's no one left alive, but he finds 7 bodies. And it turns out the 2 of them are rival Senate candidates. And I had no idea. I had that scene in like a bottle, but I had no idea who the people on the yacht were, let alone who had killed them or why. It sort of appealed to the reader in me that goes all the way back to being a kid. When you read about the ship, I want to say it's the Mary Celeste, where they find the ship that was floating out there, and it's like the table is still set. There's nothing obviously wrong, but everyone is gone.
Yeah.
And it was like, take that, add a little cheerful dose of Helter Skelter, and away we go. It's the warped workings of my mind. You give me those 2 things together, and I think this is 350 pages of fun.
Easy. I also think not to, because we don't want to give any spoilers away, but I also think about, this idea of this one cop, one person, sort of the only law of the land on this island. And it immediately goes from my mind to like absolute power corrupting absolutely, right?
Exactly.
That as soon as you're unchecked by outside forces, you will go to the very worst depths of human nature, which they do.
Absolutely. And I had wanted to, sorry to interrupt.
No.
I had wanted to write something that felt very much of our time and moment, but I don't like to hit that head on. I want that to be more in emotional subtext, not sort of headline writing. You know, I don't want, here's the best example. I don't want a Trump reference to be able to write about 2020, 2021. I don't feel like I need the pandemic, and I don't need masks. Although I started this book with that was going to be an element, and then I peeled that back, because to me, the most interesting thing is give me the emotional terrain of this moment in time, and I will pick that up and I'll move it somewhere else where I don't need everyone's the reader, I don't need their personal feelings about the headlines of the day. I just need their emotions, and then let me dig in and explore that. And I think if I'm doing my job well, no one comes out of this and says, well, he is writing a book about, 2020, 2021. But you felt that.
Yeah. Well, and particularly, again, without trying to give anything away, but it's an island that's sort of like, I want to say the island that time forgot, but like so many places in America, like industry or the local job and the thing that would have kept you afloat is suffering, right? And everyone is suffering, and sort of the outside world comes knocking, including the way sort of the less powerful are treated, if I can say that without giving anything away. And it all sort of comes onto their shores, literally like washes up on their shores. So now they have to live in this world in this time that we're all living in, but you don't allude to it specifically, but it's very much in the air and in the atmosphere. And I think that's the really powerful way to bring it to your readers. So I hear from your editor, Josh Kendall, that you love to be edited, which may itself be a bit of editing on his part. And you will not be surprised that some of these questions were inspired by him. But I wanted you to sort of discuss this uncoiling and coiling in the editorial process with Josh, who is a very hands-on editor too. And is there something about the rewriting and the reconceptualizing of plots and endings that you two do through the process that accesses a different part of your imagination than maybe your first draft? Just that process and how you two work. I think people are always really interested about that part of the craft.
Yeah, Josh is fantastic. First of all, he's an amazing editor, and I don't say that simply because I owe him another book. I've known Josh from before we ever worked together. Back when he was at Viking, I met him at the Eckerd Writers Conference, and I remember just talking books with him that night, talking craft, and we were getting into like Ron Carlson and Stuart Onan and some of these writers we both loved. And he has a very special mind, but he also, for me, working with Josh has been a really great experience because he brings a very different approach from anyone I had worked with before. And that he really likes he's a very cerebral guy, and he likes to roll up his sleeves and get down and sort of bat ideas back and forth. And being completely honest, that took me a minute because you need to figure out how to read the note beneath the note. So early on, it was like, oh, here comes Josh with another idea that's terrible, objectively just awful. And how do I tell him why this is a terrible idea? And in the course of framing my response to explain to him why this was a terrible idea, I would see a better, option in my mind, at least. And then it would always sort of, after the fact, catch up to me of, oh, okay, this is how he's getting you there in a different way. He has a willingness to get into the creative process and say, this would work. And in the rebuttal, and it requires me to explain why it wouldn't work. It would be hilarious to hear Josh's opinion of this, because I'm sure it's quite different. But that conversation leads me, it always leads the writer to new places. And I love that. I love those conversations. This book in particular is one where I remember I asked him, I usually wait until I have a complete draft to show him much of anything. And I think I gave him like 250 pages early on and said, kind of come at me on this one. And he did. And we went in a lot of different directions. So I don't know, the final page count, something like 350. I guarantee you I wrote 900 to get there. Guarantee you it might be over 1,000.
Yeah, he has to build you up to break you down.
Yeah, Josh didn't see all of them by any means. So
yeah,
I'm hiding the bad stuff from him. If he knew that, wow, he'd be really
that could be the next book you turn in that you owe him. Well, and the thing about the two of you too that's really interesting is I think you're probably the two people I could name that know like more about the genre and have read just about everything in and outside of the genre, right? So voracious readers, also like huge music buffs. And so those things, and movie and film buffs. So those three things I feel like really inform like the pop culture history that you both have sort of grown up with and how that informs your sense of story and flow and pace and all these things. I just think it's like such a good match for a good fight. Like
absolutely.
A good like
you need that
which is exciting.
And these sort of obscure touchstone that you can throw out. Josh has read everything. So
yep.
There is no book so obscure. If it's good enough to warrant a mention, he not only has read it, but he remembers, he understands the reason you're bringing it up. And those touchstones are really useful because you're always pushing against sort of fatigue with the story, particularly when you're on rewrite number 8, 9, or 10, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so something that I love about Josh, and that I hope he feels in me too, is he genuinely loves story. And I mean, the one thing that I have always sort of felt about myself was, I don't know how much talent I'm bringing, to the game. I think I'm getting better. But the one thing I absolutely believe is that there's nobody who loves it more than me. And that has been consistent. So to have those conversations where you get energized again and go back feeling that sort of renewed, love for just the undertaking of it is that's special, but you also need it.
Yeah, I think you and Josh both share like a real rigor and dedication and love for it. And that is, if you don't have that, you're not going to have the dedication to do it. And that's, as you know, from 900 pages to 350. If you're not dedicated, you'll give up before you've even started.
There's a version that I could have given it before, yes.
So Josh said he edited 4 distinct drafts of this book, and he said a good question to ask would be, which character changed the most and why did they need to? And that might be my last question for you, because then I think we're going to open it up to some of our guest questions. But who changed the most in the drafts and why did they need to?
So I don't remember how many drafts I went with it. There was a cop named McMurtry, and I viewed him as the sort of like the B story, and the principal antagonist. He ended up becoming, his name in the book is Sterling Pike, and he is Israel's uncle. So that's a pretty profound change. He went from being just a cop who had history with Israel to being family. And the reason that needed to happen was Israel was so contained as a character by design that we needed to open a door to let the reader in a little bit more emotionally, while not staying strictly rooted in the past. And every time I had been trying to find that door and open it, it was in backstory. And it's like, okay, how do we let the backstory come in and become an active character? And I still remember the phone call we had where it was like, oh, whoa, wait a minute. What if family is part of the investigation? And that was one of those exciting, energizing days. And I hung up the phone, all jazzed, and then took a look at how much needed to be cut, and that was substantial.
And then you had a drink.
And yeah, exactly. I had a drink and tried to sleep on it.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop it there, but I'm going to maybe give it back to Lauren because I think she's monitoring the questions.
Hi.
Hi.
That was so entertaining to watch. We do have a few questions. I'm going to just jump right into them. The first is from Suzanne. It's, can you tell us what you're currently working on? Are you working on something under your pen name, Scott Carson? And if you, or when the new book will come out? Very eager. People are very eager to see a new book from you. This one's not come out yet, but
That's what we want. I don't want to, bludgeon the reading public into submission. I want them to actually desire these things. July 25th, I believe, is our pub date on this. I did write another book under the Scott Carson pen name. So that's more for the people who like the weird supernatural sort of horror stories. That will come out, I don't know, sometime next winter. And what I'm working on now, the novel at the moment, I won't talk about too much. I'm actually working on the pilot episode. I'm adapting An Honest Man for hopefully a TV series. We have a great producer, a guy named Mark Roybal, who he was the producer of No Country for Old Men. He's the executive producer on Mayor of Easttown. And I love this guy. I've worked with him before. I think he gets sort of my story world better than almost anyone out there. And yeah, so I'm neck deep in that, and I'm very excited about it.
Another question from Suzanne is, do you write one book at a time, or do you work on more than one project at a time? It seems like you do multiple things at a time. You stay busy.
One book at a time. I can do a little bit of rewriting if it's sort of toward the copy edit stage and write fresh stuff, but that's about it. I have been able to write screenplays and prose at the same time, but never, it only goes for like a couple of weeks. Something has to be the dominant story. And I'm so, when I'm immersed in a draft, it's like that's the only thing. So it's pretty much one project at a time.
I'm curious, what are the different muscles you have to sort of flex when you're writing the plot of your book versus like adapting that into a screenplay?
It's a really good question. And I think, beyond the obvious change to you're at a medium now where there is no interior access. So it's everything is learning, what can the camera give? And remembering that everything on the screen, it always has to be event driven, I think, in a way that is not necessarily true of the novel, because you can play off emotional progressions without requiring the same level of event driven approach. I think one of the things that I enjoy most about the novel, though, is the ability for myself to get completely lost in the character's point of view. That's what prose does for you. That's what cadence does for you. And I struggle with that a little bit more. The screenplays are a little bit more of a battle because just the nature of the beast, the format, doesn't let me stay in the interior language as long. So two good pages on a script feels like for me. Whereas when I'm dialed into the voice in a novel, I can give you, I can do 15 or 20 pages a day. They might not be very good, but I can have a lot of fun with them.
Our next question is from Sydney. Will there be a book tour for An Honest Man? Please say yes.
Well, that question is for Sabrina, who runs all things in my life here. But I assume we're going to do a book tour. I do not know all the details yet, unless I really upset her during this conversation.
Well,
he's now not allowed out into the world. No, there will be events. You will hear of them soon.
So last year, your novel "Those Who Wish Me Dead" was made into a movie featuring Angelina Jolie. What's the experience like for you seeing your book translated into that movie, that format? It's exciting.
Sorry, it was exciting. It was a curve I had to get around to just appreciate how cool it was, which is sort of a sad thing to say, but I had been so involved in the script for a while that I had a vision of what that might be, and then 20th Century Fox folded when Disney acquired them. It got picked up by a great studio, Braun, I really like, and then Warner did the distribution. And then Taylor Sheridan, who I think is, fantastic, he took it on, and it's sort of like a mashup of, my vision and his, and another director who had it for a long time, who's not even named in the project, just because that is the nature of Hollywood. So it took me a little while to be able to remove myself from the sense of control that you have as a novelist and just remember how cool it was. And this might sound really strange, but one of the things that helped me do that was the soundtrack. The idea that anyone was putting down a score to, these events that I had originally imagined on a hike in Montana years ago and then turned into a book and then turned into a script was amazing. The movie came out during COVID, which was really, disappointing because the theaters, I think they were like just opening in some states, and they did a dual drop on HBO and theoretically in the theaters, but not much was open. So we had all these names like Angelina Jolie, Tyler Perry, John Barenthal, this great cast, Aidan Gillen, and obviously Taylor Sheridan, the writer and director. And there was no premiere. So a lot of people were kind of feeling sorry for me about the lack of that opportunity. And I probably felt sorry for myself a little bit. But I ended up I rented a theater in Maine, and I think it was capped at like 15 people or something. But I just had a small group of friends there, and someone who showed up, and it ended up being a very incredibly memorable night. I had just tossed an email out to Stephen King and said, if you have any interest. And he showed up, and that it both made that experience for me, but also it speaks to him, to his quality as a person. But also I think that like the fraternity of writers that I have been around, I was sort of like shepherded along. We were talking about how young I was. A lot of people, whether King, Michael Connelly, Laura Lippman, Dennis Lehane, I could go on and on and on. The icons in this business have been incredibly good to me and incredibly generous to me. And that is like just one really cool moment, one example of that.
I think that's a perfect way to celebrate. It sounds awesome. So we have
the entry line was great too. The house lights had already gone down, and the door opened, and you just hear. To me, he has a very distinctive voice. He said, "Mike, it's Steve. I'm here." And then he said, "It's dark as shit. Spooky."
Awesome.
It's the perfect entry for Stephen King.
That makes sense. So we have two questions from Lloyd. The first is, how much are you motivated to come up with fresh settings like Indiana Caves and or fresh expressions of violence?
I'm extremely motivated, because if it's not original, then that's when it's like you need to get out, you need to figure out something else, or at least a different type of book, different type of writing. I would rather not repeat myself. And it's a really good question, because it becomes more of a challenge with each book. I think a writer like King, who's, I don't know what he is now, 72 maybe. James Lee Burke is 86. Cormac McCarthy just put out something, he's 89. I mean, it can be done, but the more you do it, in some ways, the harder you have to work not to repeat yourself. It's a really good question.
His second question is, when do you know that a character is going to recur in your fiction, especially bad guys?
Way too late, because I'll give you like the cliffhanger book, Rise of the Dark, where I feel I'm guaranteeing you that I will come back to these characters, and then I drift away and get distracted by the new shiny thing. Villains, the only one that I feel like I just know will ride again is Dax Blackwell, or someone from that family. The Blackwell family feels very likely to reappear. But I wish I had a better gauge of what's coming next. I don't know.
Our next question is from Andy. Do you still write short stories? I've got a few collections that feature some by you, and also wonder how your thinking changes when it's shorter versus novels.
I do write short stories. I do it grudgingly. And almost always, if you look at my history of short story writing, the editor of the anthology was a friend who would deliver. And I always like to say yes. And then when the time comes to write the thing, I always regret it, because I think that form is a great challenge for me. I love it when it works, but I don't have any background in short stories. I started writing books. Even in high school, I wrote 300-page books because that was what I understood. This is what I wanted to do for a living. So not coming from sort of the creative writing school background where you would have cut your teeth on short stories, they are really challenging for me. But someone will come along and ask me to do another one, and I will say yes.
So we have two more questions. This one here is from Aaron. Tell us about the bell, unless you already did. I was late. Also, is there anywhere online people can find essays and such you've written and sign up for your newsletter?
This feels like a ringer question, probably something I didn't do well enough. Yes, michaelkoryta.com has been redesigned and has a fresh newsletter. We're going to have all kinds of exciting content there. So if you can spell my name. By the way, Sabrina disappeared. I want to know if the Live with Michael, Kortya, was a plant from Sabrina Callahan, because we have this long running joke that Michael Koryta gets better reviews than Michael Koryta, but it is Koryta. And the other question that Aaron asked beyond, can I plug my own website? I've already forgotten, but I'm sure it was great.
So our final question is from Lena. Have you had any surprising or memorable reactions from readers?
Oh, I've had a bunch. I'm trying to think of the coolest. Okay, very quickly, I guess a cool one was seeing someone bring their newborn baby through a book signing, and his name was Lincoln Perry. Last name something else, but that was really cool.
That's awesome. And I have a question for you. You mentioned earlier during your discussion that you're Sabrina mentioned, like a method writer. What's the most out there, kookiest, memorable sort of experience you've had when doing research for one of your novels? I'm sure there's so many that you probably can't even list them.
I mean, working with the big cats, definitely very memorable, for sure. But for a book called Last Words, I did a lot of caving, and those guys are crazy. Like, they're crazier than climbers, in my opinion. Yeah. So doing the long belly crawl, where if you lift your head up just a little bit, you're smacking the roof above you, and your chest is right up against the rock below, doing that kind of thing. I just remember thinking I was having a lot of fun with it at the time, but also feeling like this is just a different psychological gear. And I had done a lot of I felt like I'd been around, unique people, whether they be private eyes and cops, or people in the tiger rescue world, wilderness survival. But I'm telling you that the psychological gear on a caver is maybe the weirdest that I've dealt with.
Awesome. I think I watch way too much true crime to be confined in a dark cave.
It's different. So one of the things that I tried to do is figure out how well I could gauge the passing of time in full dark. So I went into the cave by myself and turned off every light source and tried to guess when 20 minutes had elapsed. And the first time I undercut it by, I think, 13 minutes. And then the next time I let something like 40 minutes go by. And I could not develop any gauge for how that worked. It was fascinating, but also like deeply creepy.
Yeah, I mean, if that dedication isn't a testament as to why you should pick this book up, I don't know what is. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. This will be recorded, so we'll have it on Novel Suspects YouTube channel and across Mulholland Books and Novel Suspects Online. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your night. Bye, everyone.
Bye.